Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the 19th CPC National Congress has garnered much attention from foreign observers, including former French Prime Minister Dominique de Villepin. We have an exclusive interview with him on his observations. European leaders will convene for the EU summit in Brussels. How can EU leaders improve their global standing and seize opportunities left by an isolationist U.S.? And we begin our show in Beijing, where the 19th CPC Party National Congress has entered its second day. General Secretary of CPC Central Committee Xi Jinping delivered a report to open the Congress. He stated the CPC's goal for the next half-century as socialism with Chinese characteristics enters a new era. In this new era, a more confident China will grace the global stage, shouldering more responsibilities. Take a look.
A new era, a strong voice. General Secretary Xi Jinping conveys the significance of the meeting. He says China is at a decisive stage in building a prosperous society for all as it embarks on a new era.
This new area will be an area of building on past successes to further advance our course and of continuing in a new historical context to strive for the success of socialism with Chinese characteristics. It will be an area of securing a decisive victory in building a moderately prosperous society in all respects and of moving on to all-out efforts to build a great modern socialist country.
Xi Jinping says socialism with Chinese characteristics offers a new option for other countries who want to accelerate their development while preserving their independence. It offers Chinese wisdom and a Chinese approach to solve the problems facing mankind.
No one should expect China to swallow anything that undermines its interests. China pursues a national defense policy that is in nature defensive. China's development does not pose a threat to any other country. No matter what stage of development it reaches, China will never seek hegemony or engage in expansion.
He promotes globalization to create what he calls a win-win situation for all. China's economy has maintained steady growth despite the global slowdown. The Belt and Road Initiative, a more active role in universal matters like UN peacekeeping and climate change, along with Xi's concept of building a global community of common destiny, have symbolized the country's rising position.
In addition to receiving considerable attention in China, the 19th Party Congress has attracted worldwide attention. Mr. Dominique de Villepin, former French Prime Minister, is closely watching China's growing role on the world stage. As someone who frequented China over the past few years, he certainly has some great insights into what is going on in this country. But before we talk to him, let's take a look at this.
Dominique de Villepin is a French diplomat and politician. He served as Prime Minister of France from 2005 to 2007. Prior to that, de Villepin had been appointed Foreign Minister by French President Jacques Chirac at the beginning of his second term in 2002. During this time, de Villepin made international headlines with a speech at the UN in which he voiced his country's opposition to the war in Iraq in 2003. His international reputation was made overnight. De Villepin has extensive influence in the international political arena. He is a formidable speaker with a sharp intellect and wit and is in great demand at prestigious events worldwide.
And I'm joined by Dominique de Villepin, who is the former Prime Minister of France. Mr. Prime Minister, what a pleasure to see you.
It's a pleasure.
I heard you followed the 3-hour speech of General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, yesterday.
A very historical moment.
Historical moment in terms of he announced China is entering into a new era. Having said that, though, what is the biggest takeaway for you?
Well, I really think that we are seeing one of the most, and maybe the most important political action in the last decades for the world, which is the rise of a strong China, the rise of a China that wants to take responsibility, and the rise also of a new China that is ready for new changes, and that comes for many people around the world as a surprise. This new ambition of China goes along with more pride for the nation, more unity for the party, and as well as more growth for the country and the state. So there is a new division of responsibility for the nation, for the party, and for the state, which is, I believe, something important for the years to come.
Mr. Prime Minister, you've been a politician, you served in different administrations, you understand the politics of political parties. What do you make of this very unique case of the Chinese Communist Party as the ruling party of China for decades, and this time the so-called, what you termed as new division of labor of the CPC in terms of its leadership in China?
For a Western eye, sometimes it's difficult to understand how such a party can have a responsibility that big. But I really do believe it is adapted. It suits the huge size of China. You cannot be directing 60 million people the same way you are directing 1,300,000,000 or 1,400,000,000 people. You need to have an organization that goes everywhere in the country. And the strength of the Chinese Communist Party is to have almost near 100 million people that can explain the policy, be part of the movement of the society and the movement of the state. You need to have something that plays the role that the state is playing in France, for example, structuring the society and structuring the nation and helping the state to go forward. It's a very important element of mobilization. And I had quite a few contacts and work with the Communist Party in China. And I can see how much they are not looking inwards. They are looking to the world, the transformation, the change. They are looking forward. So it's not a party that has, as some people may think, a very conservative view of the society and the world, but a willingness to modernize, to adapt, and to transform.
You see, the Chinese Communist Party also tried to update itself. Well, in what direction, of course, it still needs some time to see. Mr. Prime Minister, having said that, though, you talk about the so-called ambition of China, the Chinese Communist Party, illustrated by the 19th Party Congress report. Think about it. What exactly is China's ambition?
In a moment where we see a very worrying evolution of the United States, which is withdrawing from world affairs and becoming more a problem for the world than a solution, we need a strong China. And this is maybe the most important message of this 19th Party Congress. China is back, and China is back for good in a world that needs a country like China taking more responsibility. Already we know that China is the first country in peacekeeping troops in the world. But we need a stronger involvement of China in world affairs, in monitoring crisis. For example, the crisis of North Korea cannot be monitored without China. The same in the Middle East, the same facing terrorism, facing proliferation problems. We need more of China. And I believe that what China brings to the world today is its unity. We are facing the problem of unity in Europe, and it's a very big issue. We see the problem of Brexit, we see the problem of fragmentation, with the problem of Catalonia. We have to deal every day with states and regions aspiring to something else. China is willing to keep its unity, to be strong on nationalism, because not only you must keep the unity of the state, the unity of the country, but you must keep the unity of the people. And for that you need a spirit. Nationalism is bringing pride for the Chinese.
But of course,
pride of what they have achieved and pride of what they will be achieving. So we need China for more stability, more security, and more peace in the world. And I believe one of the very interesting projects that President Xi Jinping has brought to the world in the last years is the One Belt, One Road,
right.
the new Silk Road, which is a peaceful project, but
yeah.
very ambitious.
We're going to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative in a moment, but you mentioned something very important. You talk about nationalism. I mean, everything could be double swords, right? We also need to talk about a balance, which is an ancient Chinese philosophy that has been practicing over generations in history. So what exactly is that balance? On the one hand, you need to bring out the pride about the Chinese, among the Chinese, about their future and the role it could play in the world. But on the other hand, it will need to be an international player, as President Xi Jinping representing the country earlier in the Davos World Economic Forum in winter this year, talking about the globalization and China being a part of it.
You're absolutely right. That's one of the biggest challenges for most of the countries of the world, and mainly the ones who aspire to have a responsibility in the world of today and tomorrow. And for that, we need countries that are able to keep a long perspective. And that's maybe one of the most important gifts that China can bring to the world community is time. Not the short term in which everybody is trying to play a role and to achieve something, more money, more success. No, long-term perspective, which is going to bring to the people of the world more stability, more security, and more peace. And for that, we understand that the tools that you have, the party, for example, the state, the nation, are mobilized to have long-term perspective, long-term goals. And that's what is missing today to the Western world. The US, they are all short-term issues. For example, Donald Trump has been denouncing or not certificating the agreement with Iran. Short-term perspective. He's missing the fact that we need to fight against the risk of proliferation. And if he's going to decertificate Iran, what will be the consequences of North Korea? The same when he's denouncing the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He gets out, and of course he gives a fantastic opportunity to China to be alone, running Asia. So short-term perspective is one of the biggest problems of the West. And we need to have this long-term perspective, and the One Belt, One Road is a long-time process.
Right.
We need to be able to show that we are able to deal with tradition, what is the philosophy of our countries in the past, what is the capacity of our society to be both linked to the past and looking towards the future.
Right. Mr. Prime Minister, talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, certainly European countries have many roles to play. In that proposal, China was suggesting about partnerships instead of China being this bank, putting out cash over there and for people to use and then eventually benefit. This is going to be partnership. How is it likely to work? Have you, from your perspective, thought about that, particularly at a time when Europe, as you said, Mr. Prime Minister, earlier, is going through dramatic changes right now, at least politically?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. Partnership is key. No country can achieve everything by itself in such a complex, difficult, uncertain, and dangerous world. So we need to work together, and that is the big challenge today for Europe. We need a much stronger partnership with China. And the One Belt, One Road is a fantastic opportunity to work together. To work together along the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to work together along with the Silk Road Fund, with new tools, new institutions, and always the same objective. So partnership is key. That's a common responsibility. And of course, we must do it together. And because of the withdrawal of the US in international affairs, the responsibility for Europe to have a special action with China, I think in this very moment is key. Of course, there can be misunderstandings.
Yeah. Mr. Prime Minister, I understand you have been a globalized citizen for a long time, and you totally support globalization in the good way. But we have to mention there is the rise of the far-right politics inside Europe. In your country, before the election, you see that trend. You also see that in Germany, now in Austria, and some of the other countries as well. The question is, when you have far-right rising, which is against globalization, immigrants, and many other issues, is it possible that the European countries can work still with China on many of the initiatives that you have beautifully brought up earlier?
Well, not only it is possible, but it's absolutely necessary. If we stop working with China, we will be in a much more dangerous world, a much more fragmented world. And we have listened very closely to the speech of President Xi Jinping in Davos, inspired by free trade, inspired by modernization. We need to work with China and try to find the right path, the right tune. Of course, it's not easy. There is a trend here in Europe of people saying we should much more control our strategic investment and make sure that China is not going to be involved in some of our sectors. I think we should find the right way to create new partnerships. Avoid fear, create tools, of course, in order to go along with more reciprocity, both in Europe and in China. But through a better understanding, we would avoid fights, can help this process of better understanding.
But you know, trade is not just a trade issue. It's about market access. It's about geopolitics. It's about nationalism. It's about how you see the others and how you are being reflected in the other's eyes. So these are politics, and how will politics eventually serve or going exactly the other way around with trade, with people's lives, is a big question mark, Mr. Prime Minister.
It's a big question, and that's why hopefully we may have also in Europe some wise leaders that can understand the long-term interests of Europe. We need to try to find our way between how to answer to our people who are asking at this moment more protection against terrorism, more protection against migrations, so many migrants coming here in Europe, protection for our economies and our jobs, and at the same moment keep our philosophy and really maintain our line of an open world, free trade, open globalization.
Right.
This has to be our key, and for that we need to talk with one another, we need to create trust, and we need to show that we are able to make it. We both, China as well as Europe, we need success. We need to show that without the United States we can go forward and work closely together for the better of our people.
We need great, beautiful case studies. Mr. Prime Minister, another point I want to bring to you, that is, you heard from the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, his report yesterday, talking about building a strong, updated, modern military. He has also been very strong in terms of protecting China's sovereignty and also integrity. Many of these points have been viewed differently in different parts of the world. What do you make of it? And what do you think about a strong China in terms of defense and military? What would that mean for European countries and to you, Mr. Prime Minister?
I think it's a good news to have China assessing the fact that we are living in a dangerous world where we need to have the best ways to face the difficulties, whether it's terrorism, whether it's growing threats in so many regions of the world. We need to be able to create strong armies, and the effort on the sector of defense is also part of the agenda of Europe. One of the most important responsibility for the leaders of Europe, and President Macron has expressed himself very strongly in that regard, is to create our own capacity to defend ourselves, not relying only on NATO, but being able as Europe on the field of defense to do our part, and to do it in a much stronger way. And that's why we have increased our budget. We had the perspective of having a 2% of our budget dedicated to defense and to the army. And I think that's an element of stability. That doesn't mean you are going to make war all around the world. It means we have, as strong nations, the responsibility for the security of the world, and the first responsibility we have is to secure our people.
Before we go, Mr. Prime Minister, you've been a politician for a long time. You also have been outside of politics, observing politics from a very different perspective as a poet, as an intellect. What do you make of, let's just say generally, this generation of politics? You see our politicians also in Europe, in China, Russia, United States, different parts of the world. Is there a common personality? And how do politicians in China work from your perspective?
No, I think we have, in this regard, a very big difference. When you look at the politicians in Europe and in the Western world, they come and they go, and what's very striking is they come much often a lot younger. They have access to power. This is the case in France. It's the case in Austria, in some other parts, in Ireland, in some other parts of Europe. And you have less stability, less capacity to monitor things on the long-term perspective, which is a big difference with countries like Russia, countries like China, or countries like Turkey. The main difference relies on the fact that the big countries like China and Russia, they have faced in the last centuries a lot of difficulties and a lot of humiliation. And they have a challenge to face, which is to revive their society, to revive their capacity to play a strong role in the world. In Europe, sometimes we take democracy for granted, we take stability for granted, and we believe that we can still play with politics. And there is a lack of understanding of the importance of the challenges, long-term challenges of the world. So it's different perspective, different culture, but also different historical situations.
Beautifully illustrated. Thank you so much, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure.
Dominique de Villepin, former Prime Minister of France. Always a pleasure to learn your insights and intellect. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us.
Thank you.
And you're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you from Beijing. Still to come on our program, European leaders will convene for the EU summit in Brussels to discuss migration, defense, but also Brexit. Can EU leaders and Theresa May agree on an amicable divorce? That's the question mark. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday, live on CGTN. The two-day EU summit opens today in Brussels, with leaders set to rule out moving to full Brexit trade talks after negotiations stalled. EU President Donald Tusk dashed UK Prime Minister Theresa May's hopes for Brexit talks to progress beyond the matters of the divorce. Meanwhile, many EU leaders want to seize the opportunity created by the isolationist leanings of the Trump administration. The summit will also reaffirm their full commitment to the Iran nuclear deal regardless of an American pullout. For more about the analysis on the EU summit, what's likely to be achieved in Beijing, we have Mr. Wang Yiwei, who is the director of the Center for EU Studies at Renmin University here in China. Welcome, sir. In Brussels, we would like to welcome Fraser Cameron, Senior Advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. Long time no see, sir. It's great to have you back once again on our program. And in Southampton, we have Mike Bastian. Professor Bastian is a professor at the University of Southampton. And welcome as well. Let's get started. Mr. Cameron. The EU summit is struggling with so many priorities that I don't even know as a journalist as to where to start to ask you a question. Can you help me with that? Where to start?
Well, it's true there's a big agenda, but traditionally the October European Council deals with economic issues, and I think, you know, there's a pretty good economic story to tell. Growth has picked up. There's a new digital agenda pushed forward by the Estonian presidency. Plus, they will be reviewing the improving situation regarding migration. Then they'll be looking at a couple of foreign policy issues, reaffirming the importance of the Iran deal, taking a stance on Brexit, and I think we all know what the outcome will be, basically that there's not sufficient progress to start talks on trade just now.
Right.
And perhaps they'll find time to look at Russia and Turkey. So it's a big agenda.
It is a big agenda, and eventually will there be any consensus reached at this point compared to what we have already know, Professor Bastian? Can you help us understand better?
Well, I think I agree with the points that just made. What I would say on Brexit, obviously the conclusion will be there's insufficient progress being made, and we know progression to trade talks. But what I think the EU will announce is an internal discussion, and they will increase internal discussion amongst their 27 members as to the sort of Brexit that they would like to see. So I think that will be a positive move. So there will be some momentum gained, but it will be internal to the EU, and I expect that to be announced very, very shortly.
Okay. Professor Wang, as an observer, of course you've been watching the European countries for a long time. So there are a lot of different issues. Internally, they've got, you know, even separations within country, for example, Spain, the Catalan crisis. And then there's the Brexit. The UK might want to, on certain terms, withdraw, but they don't know. At this point, no consensus. And then there is the issue of, you know, what to do with the other parts of the world. Trade, for example, the EU has. And also migration. And then there are things within the EU, for example, it's likely to be the relations between France and Germany, which is evolving all the time. Meanwhile, you also have another issue of the EU's relationship with longtime partner and ally, the United States, reflected by the Iran crisis, and also EU's role internationally. For example, what's their stance on DPRK? All of these are facing the EU leaders at this point. Professor Wang, do you think there will be anything concrete at this point for this EU summit?
Well, I think the top agenda, of course, is about Brexit, because it's about the future of the Europe.
But you know, at this point, there is no consensus. And you know, what the UK is talking about is totally not within...
But there's a consensus that the past negotiation unsatisfied from both UK side and the European side. So we should make the progress. That's the consensus. But how to make that progress? There's the asymmetric negotiation. The UK side is eager to have some trade issue. They want to talk, negotiate with other partners like United States, China, the FTA.
Right.
But the European side is, oh, look. First, the two concerns about the mobility with the migrants, the citizens, and also about the tuition. So it's an asymmetric focus.
UK's focus, the EU is not interested. EU's focus, the UK would not be providing some satisfying answers, not even talking points. Mr. Cameron, where to go from here?
Well, I think the remarkable thing is how united the EU 27 have been. For the last several months, they've kept to the script, given the chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, full confidence that he has to speak for the 27, and that's what he has done. So basically, most of the 27 are not that bothered about Brexit. They're bothered more about how to keep the EU moving on to deal with the rest of the world, as you mentioned, and also to resolve some of their own internal problems. But the actual show is still on the road. Things are looking up on the economic front, and politically, it's not such a bad place to live and to be.
Okay, not at all. It is a fascinating place, shall I say, Mr. Cameron. And I know you're saying that not because you're working for the European policy centers, but from the bottom of your heart. And let me ask you further about that. You talk about, you know, how the EU is dealing with the rest of the world. One of the things, if we talk about concrete issues, that is the trade, right? I mean, at this point, French want to have some kinds of different kinds of deals, free trade deals. EU has it with, you know, the Latin America, Australia, New Zealand, but the France probably want to have some different kind. So how is that going to be reconciled? This is something very concrete. This is money. So, and that is the very bottom line of the EU. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. We've had divisions on trade for many years, but we always come to an agreement. For example, In the next few weeks, we'll be signing the biggest free trade deal in the world, the EU-Japan deal, ever since China joined the WTO. This is the biggest single trade deal. And the EU has many other trade deals in the pipeline, from Mercosur to dealing with Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia. We've already signed deals with Vietnam, Singapore. These are far-reaching deals. The EU is the biggest trade actor in the world and the strongest proponent of free trade. What France is simply asking now is that when there are some sensitive sectors at stake, the Commission should have a screening process to look at them. It's a pretty sensible suggestion, I think.
Professor Bastian, do you agree with what Mr. Cameron just said? During this painful transformation of the EU, actually, there are a lot of concrete things that are being done or being really concretely discussed. Professor Bastian, do you agree?
Yeah. Yes, I do, and I think I would add that the British government have shown, I think, quite tremendous misunderstanding of how the EU would react once the Brexit referendum took place and the negotiations started. I don't think they anticipated such coming together of the EU nations, really speaking as one, and all of them basically behind Barnier, and really just making the point very, very clear to the UK that they've got to pay more, they can't be seen to benefit. So yes, the EU is still solid, very, very solid. Now, individual nations, as Fraser said, will always be looking at slightly different deals, but in the end they all come together because they know in the long term they're all better off. So the UK really got an uphill task here against a solid 27-member group.
But there is one question. I earlier asked also Dominique de Villepin, who is the former French Prime Minister. There is a rise of the far right in European politics, and many of those parties are against the free trade, against the migration. So circumstances that worked before might not be what the reality is political these days for the European countries. Mr. Cameron, can we be still optimistic, let's just say, about free trade? After Japan, will the EU be able to, with the member support, go further?
Yes, it will, because the benefits of globalization are so obvious as a result
well,
of
that
the
according to you, but not necessarily according to some of the rising far-right parties in some countries. You see that in Germany, you see that in Austria. You also see that in different kinds of very promising economies earlier. So what is likely to be the picture?
Well, you were commenting just last year that people were expecting Marine Le Pen to win in France, Mr. Wilders to win in the Netherlands. It didn't happen. So the far-right parties are still very much a minority. They're only in one government at the moment, in Austria quite recently. The general trend is against the rise of populism now, and it may ebb and flow a little bit, but the majority of the political parties in Europe are still in the center ground. They're still supporting free trade, they're still supporting a market economy, and that's the good news.
Professor Wang, is that also your observation?
We hope so, but so far we are not so much expected that there's any FTA negotiation between China and the European Union. The European Union agreed that after the bilateral investment treaty, maybe it's possible to talk about the FTA, but I think now we can start to do the research, the possibility of that kind of bilateral free trade agreement, given that the global trade is I think it's now better than before. So European Union focused on the free trade, should work together with China to put forward the globalization. But the European Union still have many concerns about China's so-called global capacity, market economy, and then public procurement. So I think this is technician issues cannot be prohibited.
Professor Wang, you raised an interesting direction of discussion, which is in the apparent absence of the United States, which is talking about America first and withdrawal from the international system to some extent, will the Europeans, represented by the EU, work with other parties to seek out a new solution? Mr. Cameron, how big is that hope?
Well, it's a reality. I mean, the EU and China, for example, are now the foremost defenders of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. They're both basically committed to supporting the multilateral system, including on regional security. The EU and China are speaking with one voice on Iran, for example. To take a similar view on DPRK, another example. I think coming back briefly to the FDA question, you've got to distinguish between the kind of FTAs, the quality of FTAs, because many FTAs are just about trade, and of course that's not the most important aspect. Today's real FTAs are about services, they're about regulatory cooperation and behavior, and that is the difficulty we have with China. We do want eventually an FTA with China, but first we have to make a broad agreement on investment conditions before we can move on to the next stage. So you have to distinguish between the kind of FTA you really want in today's world. There's big differences.
Professor Wang, briefly respond.
But the service trade, I think we can start from this area, and then push for the new, like the e-commerce, and even digital economy. I think we can focus on that.
All right, a lot of different directions in our conversation, but I still want to focus on the EU summit itself. One of the things that is likely to illustrate what kind of role the Europeans would play in the future with a different America is the Iran nuclear deal. Of course, Mr. Cameron, you mentioned that earlier. Now, it's expected that the EU summit this time going to hold on to what has been agreed 2015. But if the United States did not follow it, what can the EU do? After all, it's one of your biggest achievements as the EU politically on the international stage, the Iran deal. Mr. Cameron.
Well, the EU has made quite clear they will continue to support the deal, as has Russia and as has China. Trump has not actually scuppered the deal. He's basically kicked the ball to Congress. And the EU and China have been lobbying the Congress for the last 2-3 weeks, I think quite successfully, to show them that, you know, it's much better to have Iran in this deal, containing its nuclear program, rather than being outside it. So I'm fairly confident that the deal will hold. But we, the international community, including the EU and China, have to continue to lobby for this.
Right. Mr. Cameron, you used the word successful over the past few days in lobbying the U.S. Congress. What kind of success are you specifically referring to? Can you reveal to us?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Croker, the chair of the House Representative International Relations Committee, they both come out saying the deal is good. The fact that we've got also senior members of these cabinet, including Mattis, including Tillerson, General Kelly, General McMaster, they've all said we should not scupper the deal. So I think Trump is actually pretty isolated here. He's basically appealing to his base for political reasons. He's also under pressure from the Saudis and Israel, but I think essentially we can still ensure that the deal sticks.
Will this be an interesting case study, Professor Bastin, about exactly what is going to be the role of the EU on some of the most important international issues? And this, of course, the Iran deal is totally related to what's going to happen with the DPRK nuclear issue, because it's going to be a preview as what's going to happen and what's not going to happen.
I think you're right. I think it's a very good example of a change in the balance of power in the world economy. I mean, the EU is by far China's largest trading partner, not America. And gradually, I think we will see that the power of the US decline. Trump has really, again, shown tremendous misjudgment. He is, as Fraser says, totally isolated on this. And I think it will highlight the fact that really the EU, in support with China and Russia, are really moving most of the agendas facing the global economy forward, and it may well be that the Americans actually don't scupper the deal, that there could be a change, quite likely that will be the case. So the EU are really moving into the forefront, replacing the Americans, really.
Professor Wang, are you as optimistic as the other two colleagues? Is this a show of relevancy of the EU and China and other countries reflected by the Iran deal? Or is it a demonstration of irrelevancy of these countries when the United States withdraw from certain kinds of agreement?
Even go beyond that, I always argue that when I work in Brussels, the China and the European Union actually share more common values in the international stage, multilateralism, multipolar world, and also diplomatic negotiation. So the U.S. is more bilateral, even unilaterally, and so I think the China and European Union should work more closely to push forward globalization, global governance.
All right. And before we go, there's one crucial question I also want to ask all of you very briefly. At this time, we don't see much as to who will rise as one of those leaders of the EU. Previously, we talked about Germany and France. Now we see both have some difficulties dealing with their internal issues. Mr. Cameron, is there going to be new leadership within the EU, leading the EU countries further, besides just the European Commission?
It's always been the same, and it will continue to be the same. It will be France and Germany. So Merkel and Macron will continue to lead the EU.
All right. Well, Professor Bastian, do you agree with that? Very briefly from you.
I agree, but if that was in order, I think I would say Germany and France. I think Germany is still by far the strongest economy, not just in Europe, but very, very robust and resilient. German brands have a global reputation, and particularly in engineering, and I think that will remain the case.
Professor Wang?
Well, it used to be the Mercosi. Now maybe it's 2M, you know, Macron and Merkel work together. This, I think, China would hope of the European Union play a more important role in the world.
Well, certainly the EU summit has a lot of things to struggle with, and possibly some hope as well arise from there. We want to thank the three of you for being with us. Fraser Cameron, Mike Bastian, Wang Yiwei. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you so much. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for insights across China and around the world. Good night.